Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for being here at the sixth Malamovi seminar of this year. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Chen Lin. Professor Lee is an associate professor of mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins. He's also a member of the Laboratory of Computational Sensing and Robotics and of the Center of Functional Anatomy and Evolution. Professor Lee received a bachelor in physics and economics from Peking University. He moved to the US, in particular to Georgia Tech, to get a PhD in physics. He has been postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley, and is at JHU since 2016. Professor Lee works at the intersection of biology, robotics, physics, and started his work on Terradynamics during his PhD work. That he continued his postdoc and is working on many other projects right now. So Professor Lee is also studying snakes, climbing, and cockroaches, and his research has been published on super top journals like PNAS, Science, and many others. Professor Lee received a Miller Research Fellowship from UC Berkeley, a Boros Vekon Fan Career Award from the Scientific Interface, Army Research Office Young Investigator Award, Beckman Young Investigator Award, and he's also been selected as an alumnus of the National Academy of Science, Kavli Frontiers of Science. He's member of APS, SICBI, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, and has served as reviewer on Science, Nature, PNAS, Nature Communications, and many others. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from Professor Lee. So thanks a lot for your kind availability to give a seminar in our series.
Thank you, Alessandro and Kathleen, for inviting me, and thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about my lab's work on the terradynamics of animals and robots in complex terrain. Yeah, so my lab focused on understanding the mechanics and dynamics of the interaction with complex terrain, how this helps shape animals' movement, sensing, control, and planning strategies, as well as how the principled understanding of this terradynamics can help improve the functions of bio-inspired robots in the complex real world. Yeah, so here is just a slide giving a snapshot of the various directions we have been studying in the lab. Yeah, so in the first several years of the lab, we focused on the three on top, these three directions, and more recently we have branched out into these newer areas. And we take an interdisciplinary approach by trying to integrate the knowledge and approaches from these three fields. So today in the talk, I will mostly be talking about three areas. First, I'll spend about half of the time to give a deep dive on our work on cockroach and cockroach robot going through cluttered terrain. And then I'll talk a little bit about our snake robot work on highly uneven terrain. And finally, I will talk about a very recent effort to understand how spiders sense vibrations using robot modeling. Yeah, so we have envisioned robots helping humans do many important things. So here are just a few examples of this in the terrestrial domain. You can see a lot of robots that have been developed over the years in the lab, and some of them are already venturing out into the real world and doing very well. Robotic vacuums, as we all know, and more recently, self-driving cars. And if you look at the approaches of these robots dealing with complex environment, it is very often by creating a geometric map. For example, here, the self-driving car is scanning its environment to create geometric maps and identifying what are the obstacles that it needs to avoid. And in order to reach their goal, you have to make these transitions across various driving modes to navigate around obstacles. In order for this approach to work well, you have to have a very good physical interaction with the real world that's well understood, and so that such that you can control the robot to follow the planned trajectory really well. Yeah, in the case of wheeled vehicles, we have well-established fields of tire and vehicle dynamics, as well as terramechanics that allows us to control very well how wheels interact with paved roads as well as off-road environment. Similarly, for non-wheeled systems, for example, legged robots, we also have this long history of a very rigorous understanding of the fundamental interaction of legs with the ground. For example, Mark Raybert, who is the founder of Boston Dynamics, was actually a professor for quite a while, focusing on understanding the dynamics of leg-ground interaction. And building on his fundamental understanding, this had provided really the hardware foundation for the amazing robots that we see from Boston Dynamics. They all have this kind of spring mass like bouncing pogo stick, like bouncing gait, which dates back to Mark's early research. And you can then apply on top of that sensing, control, and planning strategies to perform these tasks. By contrast, animals, they, unlike the robots that heavily rely on geometry-based map to avoid obstacles, animals in such a complex 3D environment, they very often make use of physical interaction with what robots would otherwise consider as obstacles to traverse, as shown by just a few examples. And you can see they also very often transitioning across these modes that are highly novel, way beyond the rigid ground hopping, of walking and running gaits that we saw in a lot of the robots. Yeah, so we have this vision. Can we expand this approach rather than just avoid obstacles? Can we make use of these obstacles in the environment to traverse such complex 3D terrain to perform these tasks? And how do we compose locomotor transitions across these novel modes towards that? Yeah, so this has driven much of my lab's earlier work with cockroach as a model system. Yeah, so just a bit more background. So there have been, as we first started studying legged locomotion, the field has focused naturally on relatively simple task of moving on rigid ground, where an animal is mostly in steady state, displaying these limit cycle-like cyclic behavior. And then after the earlier work, then there's more focus in trying to understand how to stabilize yourself when you get perturbed from this steady state movement. But in such complex 3D terrain where you have large obstacles, obviously you would keep getting knocked away from such limit cycle behavior. Yeah, so how do we understand this? And even beyond, still we have a lack of conceptual framework to understand locomotor transitions emerging from physical interaction. Yeah, so also, yeah, I guess a little bit more recently, there have been this trend of applying reinforcement learning to train robots to go overcome these kinds of obstacles. And you can see that you can expand the performance envelope of these robots into rougher terrain, and also even to start doing something that is called robotic parkour. And you can see that certainly it's an improvement over previous work, but still there's large limitations. We still heavily rely on stabilizing around limit cycle behavior with transient unsteady mode, which we lack fundamental understanding. And there's also almost no intuition from this deep black box, deep training approach. And finally, compared to the animals' agility, there's still much to be desired. Yeah, so I first started thinking about this when I was postdoc with Bob Fo at Berkeley. In his lab, we have all these cockroaches. So I focused on the discoid cockroach, which moves through these complex forest 3D terrain. And you can see this seems formidable. There's just a vast diversity of terrain. How do we even begin to understand this? At that time, I had a very naive idea that, to focus on vegetation, but even vegetation is highly diverse. So I decided to focus on grass and created these laser cutting paper assembled into grass-like beams to study how they traverse. And after studying many animals, going over many trials, you can see if you look at one trial, it seems unpredictable what the animals will do. But when you have a lot of trials, patterns start to emerge. Specifically, this animal can transition over many different modes, but they most frequently use this roll mode, which is shown in this video on the top left. You can see the animal tries to push through, but then transitions to roll the body to be aligned with the gap, and then maneuver through. Yeah, so as I started my lab, we had this, again, on hindsight, it might seem naive, but there just doesn't seem to be a way to understand this in a universal strategy. So we kind of thought, what types of large obstacles can we abstract from this challenge? And we thought of these few representatives. There are obstacles you might need to really go over, and then ones you need to bridge as a gap. You have these flexible vegetation-like obstacles, but also rigid ones. Yeah, so we started thinking about, can we study these as almost a primitive, motion primitives, how to understand the animal's locomotor transitions emerge from interaction with these obstacles, and eventually maybe you can compose high-level locomotor tasks from this understanding. Yeah, so over the years we developed various techniques, for example, to create simplified yet variable and controllable tools such as these beams, with which we can change the stiffness, the bending stiffness. Also techniques to combine multiple cameras to track, especially when the animal is occluded by an obstacle, to track their movement, and as well as the movement of the terrain if they move. Also, this is a tool that we developed to try to study them over long spatial temporal scale. Using these tools, we can then study both animals as well as very simple robophysical models. These are the Rex-like robot invented a couple decades ago. We can then perform systematic experiments to vary the parameters of these to the extent possible, and then study to try to discover general physical principles. And building on these experimental data, we can then create various kinds of physics models to try to understand what's happening. Yeah, so here we have very simple intuitive models called potential energy landscape, which I'll talk a lot about. We also have dynamic templates, which are basically writing down equations of motion for systems that are simple enough to do so. And finally, multi-body dynamic simulation. Yeah, so over the next part, I will focus on this beam traversal system using potential energy landscape, which turns out to give us surprising insight that's general. Yeah, so after several years of study, we eventually we realized that it turns out for all these diversity of obstacle traversal as well as self-riding, which is the task where you get flipped over, you have to come back onto your feet. It turns out that this potential energy landscape gives us the insight or an approach to understand locomotor transitions. So what we find is that in all of these tasks, it turns out there are a few distinct stereotyped locomotor modes that can emerge. And when we measure the system and reconstruct this potential energy landscape, it turns out that each of these modes emerge because the system is attracted to a basin on the landscape. So you can use the landscape to conceptualize locomotive transitions as transitions between basins, hopping over potential energy barriers. And this view can allow us to understand and even to devise new strategies, whether it's changing your morphology or changing your body shape, or even adopting different new shapes, but also how to control your body and leg actuation, and even plan a little bit ahead with reactive and planned control to make the right transitions to modes, because there are some modes that lead you to be stuck in the obstacles, whereas there are others that can lead you towards traversal. Yeah, so this conceptual framework allowed us to understand how to do these in an intelligent way, and it helped us achieve performance much more than without such consideration, which I'll show an example later. Yeah, and then I'll skip this. Yeah, so if you're interested, we have a review paper reviewing this work. Yeah, so I'll then take a deep dive into this beam system to kind of explain how we understand all this. Yeah, so here we have these two modes which the animal tend to display. If the animals try to push across very flimsy beams, then they just push the beams down, in which their body pitches up a bit because of the restoring torque from the beams. Alternatively, when they encounter very stiff beams, then they tend to not do that. They tend to try to first want to push over, but they couldn't do it. And then as they continue to push, you can see they rapidly transitions into the roll mode. So with these techniques, we can reconstruct the system and calculate the potential energy landscape. Yeah, so here, when we think about what's happening, the very first naive idea we had is, oh, if we just ignore the dynamics and the complex interactive forces, we just calculate the total potential energy of the system, which is the sum of the gravitational energy of the body and the beams, as well as the elastic energy of the beam in this torsion springs. Then we can calculate this energy as a function of the body's position in the on this plane, as well as the pitch, roll, yaw, we do have a constraint that the body touches the ground, which is roughly true from the animals. They don't, even though despite the legs, their body is really close to the ground. Anyway, with this, we can calculate here, for example, a snapshot of the potential energy of the system as a function of body pitch and roll when the body is right in the middle of these two beams. So you can see there are three basins that emerges. There's this pitch basin. If you fall to the bottom of the basin, the system would look like this, the configuration. Whereas there are these two other basins. If you fall to these basins, then it look like you rolled either to the left or to the right in the beams without deflecting the beams. So these are reminiscent of what happens during the pitch and roll mode. So this led us to hypothesize that perhaps this transition from the pitch to the roll mode is a barrier crossing transition on the landscape. Yeah, but is this true? Later we collected a lot of data for this system. For example, we did see that the animal data, as you expect, is always very noisy, but when you look at the average, it actually does go from the pitch basin to the roll basin. And what's really remarkable is tend to go over the saddle point, which it has the lowest potential energy barrier. Yeah, so I'll talk about that a bit later. But when we first started, we actually had a very naive idea that we were inspired by a microscopic system. When you have a potential energy barrier, if you have some thermal fluctuation, then you can use that kinetic energy to probabilistically hop across the barrier to make a transition. So we thought, oh, if there's no sensory feedback at all, then transition should happen only when the kinetic energy fluctuation is greater than the potential energy barrier. So and if you this might sound crazy because it's all purely physics driven, but if you look at the animal, they do have this body oscillation just from their leg pushing against the ground and interacting with the obstacle. Yeah, so we developed the first system of a robot that can be driven forward and has a gyroscopic mechanism that allows it to freely pitch and roll. So we can then drive it forward and apply various level of oscillation to change the kinetic energy fluctuation. Yeah, so here are just representative trials with and without the kinetic energy fluctuation. You can see without it, it's stuck in that pitch mode. With it, it very quickly transitions to the roll mode. Now with our tracking and reconstruction, we can calculate the potential energy landscape, which changes as you move forward because it's also a function of your forward displacement. Yeah, so you can see this evolving landscape, and we can then visualize all the trials on the landscape. What's shown in blue and the trajectory are all the trials that are stuck in the pitch mode, and then these red ones are ones that go into the roll mode. Here there's a symmetry breaking because there's a little bit of asymmetry that always rolls to the right. That's why you see it always come to the side. And then, yeah, sorry, but then you see that indeed all the pitch mode are stuck in the pitch basin, and the roll mode very quickly transitions to the roll basin. And then when we calculate from this reconstruction, we can calculate how much that barrier is, and also the kinetic energy that we input. You can see that here's where you have more kinetic energy than the barrier. And it turns out that's exactly where the system makes the transition. So this confirms a hypothesis of this purely physics-driven system. And more recently, we have started to try to develop a stochastic dynamic model of this transition. So here is a multi-body simulation, dynamic simulation of the system, showing a lot of trials, which depending on how much noise you get, you either get transition to the roll mode or you're stuck in the pitch mode. We can then apply this Langevin equation, which people have applied to microscopic system, in a very limited way to macroscopic system. We can try to fit the Langevin equation, and you can see it does a pretty decent job in predicting the probability distribution evolution of the system. Yeah, back to the system. Obviously, animals, they're not just dumb particles. They can do intelligent things. So we test whether this is true in the animal, and we get basically everything is the same, that they also have these transitions and which correspond to attraction into the basins, but except that the transitions of the animal happens when the kinetic energy fluctuation is still less than the barrier. So yeah, this again is not surprising because animals can do smarter things. So this led us to look more into the animals. So in this later study, we measured and quantified. Yes.
If I interrupt you, I have a question about a couple of questions actually about the previous experiments on cockroaches. Okay, so this one, for example, yeah, it's good. So the first one is so as far as I know, the most famous model of cockroaches, locomotion of cockroaches, is on the horizontal plane
On
and
the
horizontal plane.
yes.
While here, uh, these experiments are implying that in many situations, actually cockroaches don't move in the horizontal plane. And
So
yeah.
uh,
And so it looks like that the model is valid. That model ends up being valid only in restricted amount of situations. So the true model should have a third component. Am I correct?
so I guess there are two things. So first, I don't think there's any like detailed quantification of cockroach behavior in the field, but on the other hand, it is, I guess, at least there's anecdotal knowledge that these animals, the environment they live in is really flat. Yeah. But I wouldn't say that the flat ground, the spring mass, like lateral leg spring bouncing model is incorrect. It's just that it's, but naturally people started with simplified environment. Okay, so yeah, so we look more closely
Yeah.
at
So there is another small thing that I want to ask about the previous experiment when you introduce actually the one when you introduce randomness. So usually the stability regions of this deterministic model is very small. So so when you introduce randomness, of course, you expect that there is some sort of change in the stability. Now, my question though is, how do you know where it's gonna go when you introduce the randomness? Because it might be that it goes to different new equilibria. So how do you know to which equilibria do they go?
which equilibrium do they go?
Yeah, which stable limit cycle do they go? Because when you introduce, you know that there is this limit cycle, you know that the stability region is small, you
Uh,
introduce randomness, then you know it's gonna move from that limit cycle, but
uh,
then you don't know where it's gonna go. How do
yeah,
you
yeah,
know that?
that's a good question. So in the robot, it's just all physics. Like if there's a if you happen to have enough randomness to cross this barrier, you just fall to the adjacent ones. In the animal, we think you can. There's probably more intelligent strategies, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Okay. But yeah, I want to try to rush through because we started a bit like 10 minutes late. So yeah, so we then looked at what animals can do that might be more intelligent. So we found, oh, they have these leg adjustment, which seems to reduce their rollability right before they roll. They also push one leg and withdraw one leg, which seems to be generating a torque. And then they also flex their head and the abdomen as they push against the beams, and after they roll into the gap. We think that these are likely to help them get unstuck because there are these interlocking interaction of these corners and edges together. The head flexion, we still don't understand yet, but we think it might be a form of active sensing, which is related to what I'll talk about. But anyway, having studied all this, this gets back to my earlier slide where we studied a variety of obstacles. So at this stage, we tested a robot that combines various actuation strategies from our earlier insight to allow the robot to traverse clutter large obstacles, achieving performance far exceeding the without such understanding. But anyway, yeah, what we have been recently working on in this direction is how to use this in real locomotion. Like how do you sense this potential energy landscape? It's not something you can see like a real landscape, but it makes sense to be able to sense it and find the saddle. Yeah, so we're inspired by the field where you can make use of proprioceptive sensing as well as tactile sensing to somehow get an idea of your contact, but also the resistance from the environment, how hard it is to push against. Yeah, so we developed a new robot which has force sensors embedded, but also contact sensors on the outside with which we can measure the force and torques. Yeah, so here's a simple experiment where we just push the robot. We set it to a specific pitch and roll, push it across, and then we redo it with a different pitch and roll. So we can sweep the pitch and roll parameter space. And then what we first found is that when we measure the obstacle force and compare that to the gradient of the landscape, it turns out to match really well, which is actually surprising because the gradient of potential energy landscape is all conservative forces and torques, whereas the real obstacle force can have non-conservative components, but it turns out that they match quite well. And then we can then integrate the gradient estimated from this force sensing to over the pitch and roll space to reconstruct the landscape, and you can see it actually matches quite well. So this shows that that there's a chance we can do this, but the real challenge is how to do this in free locomotion, not doing a systematic parameter sweep. And here we're inspired by the area where people look at odor sensing, where the animals they have a general trend to go towards the odor in a almost straight trajectory, but not exactly straight. They very often do these lateral movement, which adds a second dimension. Even though they're still following a curve, they can do a full 2D sweep. By moving laterally, they actually can gain more information about the odor landscape. So we're really inspired by these cross-wind turns, and we developed a strategy where we, here illustrated, we first are stuck in that basin, and then we start turning on some oscillation, and then this helps us gain some information of the local gradient field to then figure out where the saddle is, and then we move towards the saddle. But along that way, as we start to lose information, we move laterally to get more information. So this turns out to help the simulated robot traverse. And most recently, we're just trying to apply all this to a free running robot. And this turns out, we think this will be the data will be very noisy, so we might, again, get inspired from other fields to try to use some simple neural networks to make sense of this. And then so kind of the longer term vision is we want to add this physics-based interaction landscape to try to enable traversal through composition of locomotor transitions. Yeah. And next I'll spend a little bit of time about the snake. Yeah, so this is recent work. So earlier we studied snake going over very large step-like obstacles, but in that study we just, out of curiosity, we tried this really kind of uneven terrain, and we found that the snakes seem remarkable. You can see they barely slip. They seem to be moving along a virtual tube, whereas this is the robot that's one of the best at the time, and you can see it's really when you speed it up 10 times, you can make some progress, but it really kept struggling, slipping a whole lot. Yeah, so this indicates that the snake can generate good propulsion, whereas the robot cannot. Yeah, so when we look at then the snakes are well known to have these 4 common gaits that are well understood, and you can see that they, except for sidewinding, which has a little bit of lifting, it's mostly just relying on body motion in the 2D plane. Again, like naturally people start studying such simple surface. Specifically where you use lateral bending to generate propulsion, there's a lot of understanding of how they can push against discrete obstacles to modulate the propulsion and even enable robots to do this well. But there's relative lack of considering of 3D bending with vertical component. Yeah, so we studied this more carefully. We developed a technique to reconstruct their body from these markers. And again, you can see it's almost like a virtual tube. They barely slip sideways, except here, this is the body, the head turning, and the body follows. Yeah, so we can now use this to take a cross-section cut of the entire animal body and unwrap it to see how it's interacting with the obstacles here. And then from this, at this stage, we don't yet have force measurements, but we can use this kinematic measurement to get some idea. Here you can see, for example, there's a red contact here and here and here. If it's moving from left to right, and here, then it's likely that the animal is using its body to push against these corners forward, showing in the red arrows. And this one is in the horizontal plane, pushing laterally. So we then counted how many lateral and vertical bending push points you have, and we found that they're comparable. So this gives us initial evidence that snakes in 3D terrain, they really can also rely on vertical bending, not just lateral bending. And we even see it from YouTube's videos of snakes seemingly doing this in the nature. Yeah. So again, we don't have force measurements yet. I'm hoping to get funding to study this more carefully, but stuck. Sorry, this seems to be freezing my PowerPoint. Let's see if this view works. Oh, okay. I'll skip this slide. Yeah, so we have done a study using robots as a tool to test various control strategies using no contact feedback, or only using the head contact feedback or the full body contact feedback. And as you would expect, when you have tactile information from the entire body guiding your feedback control, it does better. Yeah, and then we also developed a robot with 3D force sensing. So there are these force sensors on both the belly and the side of this robot that allows it to sense force. And we're hoping to do further studies. And then we develop a prototype of low-cost 3D force sensor. And yeah, if we get grant, we want to study this more carefully, how to measure the force and then understand how they are doing the feedback control. Anyway, the last part, should have enough time. So I'll talk about this recent area where we study the spider vibration sensing. Yeah, so spiders, web making spiders, they are very good, as you see here, at detecting and localizing a prey. This is in real time, and they do this. They are functionally blind, but they rely on vibration sensing. So here, when you have a tuning fork on the web, then they respond to it. Yeah, so they have all these very highly sensitive lyriform organ, which are little slits that will get compressed when the vibration is present to then trigger the response. And these are distributed along their entire leg. But if you think about this problem, it's not just the spider. There's also a web. So whatever vibration the prey generates needs to be transmitted across the entire web, even through the legs, to be sensed by the web, by the spider. So it's really a couple system of the prey, the spider, and the web. In order to understand this, we have to really be able to measure this couple system. And also spiders have the ability to modulate their vibration sensing. And there are a lot of behaviors, and from my review, I found that it's mostly divided into two types. There's a very long time scale web construction behavior. They can modulate their web material, geometry, etc., and tension to modulate the vibration sensing. But there's also short time scale behavior when they actually detect prey, which is much less studied. And really because of the limitation I just said, that you really need to measure everything of this couple system, including the behavior of the animal, which is just very hard to do with the existing technology. So here, so our collaborator here, Andrew Gordis' lab, had been looking at how the behavior here, you can see this particular behavior where the spider does this dynamic leg crouching during prey sensing. Yeah, so this is our focus. Yes, and when you look at real animal data, you can see every time you like the spider rebuilds a web every day, and every time you drop a prey, they're gonna move over, they can cut that prey away, etc. So it's gonna change the web. So it's just impossible to do repeatable experiments, and their behavior also is highly unpredictable. Yeah, so also there's basically, if you want to measure all the vibrations here, you have to buy a equipment that's like almost $1 million. So it's just impossible to do. So we decided to use robot modeling. So we created this robot which can do this dynamic crouching, and a prey robot that shakes. And we also measure tension as well as all these points tracked to quantify the web vibrations. We also have accelerometers on the leg to measure the vibration in the legs. Yeah, so just some initial work here. These are the accelerometer data. What we do here is we let the spider robot that do one of these dynamic crouching, which is this part of the data. And after that, you can see that it induces a passive shaking for a while. So it turns out, yeah, through a lot of preliminary analysis, we realized that this is the most critical data. So we zoom in here, and you can see we can align all of these different accelerometers on different legs. You can see they have all these similar trends, and we can then perform a Fourier transform to look at the frequency component, and you can see the data is highly repeatable from the robot, very little error bars. And now we look at the problem in two aspects. First, can we detect whether there's a prey or not? So here we're comparing the Fourier transform of the data with and without prey. After the spider does one dynamic crouch, you can see there's clearly difference. Without the prey, there's a single peak, and then with the prey, this single peak actually shifts to the left, and there's a new peak emerging to the right. Yeah. So what this means is that the presence of a prey creates a second frequency vibration. We can also try to see whether you can have some idea of the direction of the prey. So we can compare data across four legs on the four accelerometers on the four legs, and you can see that they all seem quite similar. There's maybe some quantitative difference, but we haven't seen enough evidence to give us a firm idea which direction the prey is. Yeah, but then we looked more closely at the distance of the prey. So here we put the prey on different threads, further or closer to the spider robot, and what we see is that this first peak that is there even when without a prey is still there, and it has about the same frequency, whereas this new peak actually, the further you go, then the closer you go, then the higher the frequency of this new peak. Yeah, so these are just two representative trials. Here are all the data. When you move the prey from the farthest to the closest, you can see that the first frequency doesn't change, whereas the second frequency monotonically goes up. Yeah, so we think that the location of the prey is encoded in this this new frequency. Yeah, and when we take a closer look at the web vibration from the tracking of these points, what we found is that if we again perform a Fourier transform of the web vibration data, we can identify these two peaks. And if we plot here the second peak, this new peak, we can plot the magnitude of this frequency vibration across the web, and then we can compare them. So here we did this for the first frequency peak, and then the second frequency peak. We look at the spatial distribution of this particular frequency vibration's magnitude, and we found that this first frequency peak seems very uniform across the web, whereas the second one seems to be very high on this thread where the prey is on. Yeah, so this give us the suggestion that this first peak is mostly the web vibrating induced by the dynamic crouching of the web, whereas the second peak is the passive vibration of the prey robot induced by that vibration, which occurs at a different frequency. And when you look at this video, you can sort of see that the web vibrates at a lower frequency, whereas the prey vibrates at a slightly higher frequency. Yeah, so just to summarize, we found that the dynamic crouching seems to induce this vibration, which leads the prey to generate a different response, which can be used to detect whether there is a prey and also how far it is. So it's almost like a echolocation. But as you have noticed, we only had 4 legs in our old robot due to the limitation of the manufacturing. Yes, and also it has a very small range of motion. So recently we collaborated with another lab. A master's student developed a robot with 8 legs with a much larger range of motion, much more biologically accurate. We're also trying to improve the physical web, which we think is also not quite closely representing the real web. So our next step is to use these more biologically accurate systems to try to understand this detection of the direction, as well as even more interesting closed loop interaction between the animal, the predator and the prey. Yeah, so with that, our longer term vision is that we want to add these terradynamics, or the understanding of the physical interaction with the environment, and how to make use of this to guide design, control, planning on the robotics side, but also to help us understand how animals move better, and perhaps to apply robotic technology to help preserve our natural world. Yeah, with that, I want to thank all my lab members, specifically the ones listed here who have contributed to the work presented, and a lot of colleagues, my advisors, collaborators who have helped, and of course the funding agencies. Yeah, thank you all very much for hearing my talk, and I can take more questions.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for the great presentation. So I can start with some questions. For example, the experiment with the snakes. Now, I don't know if it makes sense, but have you tried to just remove the control, incline the surface that you have, and let the snakes like fall down?
So sorry, can you say again? I didn't quite get.
So let's say the experiment with the snakes.
Okay.
Okay. So you have a complicated setup, like with many different. The environment is complex. Okay. So I was wondering what happens if you incline the surface, the snake is asleep, and you just let the snake slide down. What happens in that case? Like no control, just passive.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess there are two things I want to say. One, people actually have studied this. Snakes, as you know, they have scales that are pointing mostly backwards. So people have done exactly the experiments you mentioned. They put the snake to sleep with anesthesia, let them slide. If their head is facing down, then there's very little friction. So with a shallow angle, they slide down. If the head is facing upward, then that friction is much higher. So it'll take a much higher slope for them to slide down. And then, but what's surprising is that actually laterally, if you put them this way, laterally, that friction turns out to be even greater than sliding backward. That's due to the morphology of the scales. And this turns out to be really important in snakes to break symmetry, to generate forward motion with a almost symmetrical looking traveling wave. But the other thing I want to say is we did think a little bit about this vertical bending, pushing against the environment. One idea we had, we speculate that this, because of this same effect, the gravity, if that slope is steep enough, gravity is helping you just slide down. So this might actually help snake make use of local contact points that are steep enough that maybe they don't have to do much active muscle work, just enough to overcome maybe frictional loss. But gravity can just help you. Imagine you put a rope on a steep slope, it's gonna, at the right slope, it's gonna just slide down. So this might potentially be something that they use. Yeah.
So the other question is, so you have described in detail cockroaches and snakes, which to me they're kind of relatively extreme species, right? I don't say that. It says that there is something in between, right? So have you done something in between, like
my lab hasn't done specifically, but like Dan Goldman, my PhD advisor, has recently, in the last more than 5 years, done a lot of work on centipede, looking at centipede and building centipede-like robots. And it turns out that they, from their recent research, they think that when you combine these two, it can give highly robust performance without even any sensory feedback, like basically the morphology, the compliance of the body and the legs, as well as having many legs that somehow they can corroborate to deal with perturbations to collectively drive you forward without any sensory feedback control. That's one major insight I have had.
That's actually interesting because I've seen some videos on YouTube of some artists which built these very complicated structures, which move on on the sand, which just through wind, and they look like they're moving, like they're controlled, but actually they just move. Right, and so the fact that you mentioned the centipede reminded me that because these structures usually have multiple legs or stuff like that, right? So that's very interesting. The other thing I wanted to ask you, go ahead.
Actually, just to comment on that, I know what you're talking about. I even have a video that I show in my class, but I think there is quite different. That's actually just a passive dynamic walker using this whole field of passive dynamic walking that basically are inverted pendulum that you keep recycling energy. So that system, when you look, it's basically, there are many legs, but they're just linked together and they move like a passive dynamic walker, like vaulting over a leg to recycle gravitational energy and to make use, to generate kinetic energy, and a little bit of wind keeps supplying that energy loss. Yeah.
Maybe one small other question I have. So you mentioned the importance of detecting the location of the prey in the you know, your work on prey versus predator in the spider context, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned how important it is to locate the position of the prey based on the frequency. So I was wondering why use Fourier transform instead of things like wavelets? Because Fourier transform doesn't encode location, while wavelet can encode that too. So it may be that analyzing that slightly different analysis, right? Basically, you just run a different line of Python code, right? In which you use wavelets. It may be that not only the frequency is detectable, but also the location is detectable as well.
I see. So yeah, actually, I don't know very much about vibrations. I only learned very little from my college introductory physics course, so I don't really understand very well, but I love to chat with you to understand this wavelet aspect. I do know Ross Haddon, actually, before we started this project, a few years before, Ross Haddon at Oregon State, he, along with another researcher, they actually also try to tackle this problem. They are not looking at the behavior, the role of the animal behavior. They're really trying to understand and even mathematically like tease apart the vibration on webs. And they published a few papers that I think, if I remember correctly, I think some of them involve kind of decomposition of complex vibrations into maybe like principal component. Making an analogy, like, so I wonder if that's somehow related to what you're talking about. But I'd love to discuss with you to learn more about this.
Yeah, of course. So I think I've monopolized the question time, but if there are other questions, I mean, they're welcome. Well, if not, we can leave further questions to the aftermath. So and then it's I want to thank again Professor Lee for the great presentation. Very interesting topic. So thank you very much for your kind availability and for your interest in presenting our seminar series. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro, and
thank you.
Thank you.